At precisely 7:42 in the morning on a Tuesday in early March 2026, power grid operators inside the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, the agency that manages electricity for roughly 26 million homes and businesses, began receiving alerts that no simulation had fully prepared them for. The warnings were not about a hurricane bearing down on the Gulf Coast. They were not about a cyber attack or a catastrophic equipment failure. They were about a diplomatic decision made in Washington, D.C., and the measured, deliberate response issued from Mexico City, a response that, according to three sources familiar with the internal communications between ERCOT and the U.S. Department of Energy, arrived without the 48 hours of warning that existing bilateral protocols were supposed to guarantee. What is unfolding right now between the United States and Mexico is not simply a trade dispute. It is an energy confrontation that strikes at the physical infrastructure of the American Southwest, and if you are watching this video in Texas, Arizona, or any of the border states, you need to understand what is actually happening, because the official explanation you will hear from Washington does not come close to telling the full story. If you have found this channel recently, now is the moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what is being covered here is not the version of events that gets 30 seconds at the end of a cable news broadcast. This is the detailed, sourced, chronological account of how two administrations, one determined to assert energy dominance, the other determined to demonstrate sovereign resilience, have placed the Texas power grid at the center of an international standoff with no clean resolution in sight. To understand what happened this week, it is necessary to go back, not years, but months, and trace the precise sequence of decisions that made this confrontation not just possible, but inevitable. The story begins with a fact that is rarely discussed in American political coverage, but is absolutely central to everything that follows. The United States and Mexico are not simply neighbors sharing a border. They are, in the language of energy policy, deeply codependent. Mexico imports more than half of its natural gas supply from the United States, almost entirely through a network of pipelines originating in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. That gas powers Mexican factories, Mexican households, and critically, the Federal Electricity Commission, known by its Spanish acronym CFE, which, since President Claudia Sheinbaum's sweeping energy reform enacted on March 18, 2025, is now legally required to supply at least 54% of all electricity dispatched to Mexico's national grid. According to reporting reviewed by this channel and confirmed by multiple people briefed on the regulatory changes, that reform also dissolved Mexico's two independent energy regulators, the National Hydrocarbons Commission and the Energy Regulatory Commission, replacing them with a single National Energy Commission that reports directly to the Executive Office of the President. In practical terms, that means energy policy in Mexico is now, more than at any point in the last decade, a direct instrument of presidential authority. And that matters enormously when the president on the other side of the border makes a move that touches Mexican energy sovereignty. Before this video goes any further, take 30 seconds to click the like button if you believe that energy security is a national security issue. The algorithm buries stories like this one, and the only way this information reaches the people who need it is if you push it forward. Now, back to the timeline. The executive order that triggered the current standoff was signed in the final days of February 2026. According to three sources familiar with the drafting process inside the National Economic Council, the order had been in preparation since January, when internal White House polling showed that aggressive action on energy trade with Mexico polled strongly among the administration's core demographic. The order invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the same statutory authority used to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum, and declared that certain categories of energy-related exports from Mexico to the United States posed a threat to national security. The specific categories, named in the executive order, according to a 47-page draft reviewed by multiple industry sources, included refined petroleum products, electrical components, and, most controversially, the cross-border electricity transfers that occur along the Texas-Mexico interconnection, a set of transmission lines that carry power in both directions, depending on seasonal demand and market pricing. The White House framing was consistent with the broader American energy dominance narrative that the administration had been building since January 2025, when it declared a national energy emergency and began reversing Biden-era clean energy regulations. According to a White House fact sheet published in late February 2026, U.S. natural gas production was already at record highs, and the administration positioned the executive order as a logical extension of that dominance, a move to ensure that American energy resources were not being used to subsidize foreign state-owned utilities at the expense of American producers and consumers. But here is what the White House fact sheet did not explain, and what the next 30 minutes of this video will document in detail. The Atlantic Council, one of Washington's most respected nonpartisan foreign policy institutions, published an analysis in March 2025, nearly a full year before this executive order, warning with extraordinary precision about exactly this scenario. According to that analysis, authored by two former U.S. government energy officials, the Texas grid was already operating under significant strain from transformer shortages. Lead times for the large power transformers that step up voltage for long-distance transmission had stretched from 50 weeks in 2021 to 120 weeks by early 2024. U.S. domestic production of transformers, according to that same analysis, meets only 20% of national demand. The remaining 80% comes from imports, and a significant share of those imports come from Mexico. The report stated directly, and this is a quote that has been circulating among grid reliability engineers since the order was signed, that tariffs on Mexican-produced transformers and other electrical components would make it, and these are the precise words, considerably harder for the United States to achieve energy dominance and could prove costly for Texas. That report was available to every senior official involved in drafting the February 2026 executive order. According to two people familiar with the interagency review process, it was specifically flagged by career staff at the Department of Energy's Office of Electricity. It was not incorporated into the final policy calculus. If you are finding this information useful, and if you are the kind of person who believes that policy decisions should be made with full awareness of their consequences, share this video with one person you know in Texas. Just one. The ripple effect matters. Stay with us, because the response from Mexico City is where this story gets significantly more complicated. President Claudia Sheinbaum is not a politician in the conventional sense. She holds a doctoral degree in energy engineering from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and she completed significant portions of her doctoral research at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California. She has authored or co-authored more than 100 peer-reviewed articles on energy systems, grid efficiency, and the economics of energy sovereignty. According to multiple people who have worked with her administration on energy policy, she approaches bilateral energy disputes not with the instincts of a career diplomat, but with the analytical precision of someone who has spent 3 decades studying exactly how energy systems fail and exactly which pressure points, when activated, produce cascading consequences. Her response to the February 2026 executive order was issued not as a retaliatory tariff, unlike Canada, which responded to Trump trade actions with immediate counter-levies. Sheinbaum had consistently declined throughout 2025 to match American trade aggression with equivalent trade aggression. Instead, her counter-move came through CFE, the state electricity utility that her constitutional reforms had, by design, made into an instrument of direct executive authority. On the morning of March 3, 2026, CFE issued a technical operational notice, document number CFE OPS 2026-117, running to 23 pages, announcing what it described as a scheduled maintenance and grid rebalancing protocol, affecting cross-border transmission capacity along 3 interconnection points in the Tamaulipas, Texas corridor. According to 2 engineers familiar with the ERCOT CFE interconnection infrastructure, the lines affected by that notice carry between 800 and 1,100 megawatts of power during peak summer demand. In winter and early spring, the flows are smaller but still operationally significant, particularly for the industrial load centers in the Rio Grande Valley. The notice specified a reduction in available cross-border transmission capacity of approximately 60%, effective March 5, 2026, today, and lasting, according to the document, for an indeterminate operational period pending resolution of bilateral infrastructure coordination agreements. Multiple people briefed on the reaction inside ERCOT described the notice as technically compliant with the letter of existing bilateral operating agreements, while simultaneously being, in the words of one grid reliability official who spoke on condition of anonymity, the most precisely calibrated disruption they could engineer without triggering the emergency consultation clauses. This is the point in the story where the details matter most and where the consequences for ordinary Texans become most concrete. ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, operates one of the most isolated major grids in the United States. Unlike the eastern and western interconnections, which span dozens of states and provide enormous capacity for emergency power imports from neighboring systems, ERCOT has only limited connections to external grids. There are approximately 2.5 gigawatts of direct current ties connecting Texas to Mexico and to neighboring U.S. grid regions, a number that grid reliability experts have described for years as dangerously insufficient given the pace of Texas's industrial and population growth. According to an ERCOT long-term planning document published in late 2024, the agency was projecting the need to double total power generation capacity by 2030 to meet demand from population growth, industrial expansion, and the extraordinary electricity appetite of data centers serving the artificial intelligence industry. That build-out was, according to the same document, critically dependent on the uninterrupted availability of imported electrical components, including transformers manufactured in Mexico. Pause this video for a moment and leave a comment below. Tell us, do you think Texas's grid vulnerability is the result of deliberate policy failure, or is it simply the consequence of decisions that seemed rational at the time but were never stress-tested against a scenario like this one? The most thoughtful answers will be featured in a follow-up video. Here is what the next 72 hours look like, based on what 3 sources familiar with emergency planning discussions inside ERCOT and the Texas Public Utility Commission have described. The immediate operational impact of the CFE transmission reduction is manageable under current conditions. Temperatures in early March are mild, industrial load is moderate, and reserve margins, as of this morning, remain within acceptable bounds. But the forward timeline is what is generating alarm among grid reliability engineers, and according to 2 people briefed on internal communications among senior officials at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Washington. The larger problem, the one that the CFE maintenance notice has forced into sharp relief, is structural. The transformer shortage that the Atlantic Council warned about in March 2025 has not improved. It has worsened. According to industry sources familiar with procurement data from major Texas utilities, lead times for large power transformers as of February 2026 remain above 100 weeks. The executive order signed in late February, which imposes new restrictions on energy-related imports from Mexico, affects not just the cross-border electricity flows that CFE has now reduced. It affects the supply chain for the physical hardware that Texas needs to build the generation and transmission capacity required to close its reliability gap before summer 2026. Texas's summer peak demand is not an abstract planning concern. In the summer of 2024, Hurricane Beryl, a storm that did not make direct landfall on Houston, left millions of residents without power for days, in some cases for more than a week. Grid reliability experts who testified before the Texas legislature in the aftermath of that event stated that the consequences of a transformer shortage could produce outage events that are structurally more severe than storm damage, because storm damage is localized and equipment can be redistributed from unaffected areas. A systemic shortage of transformers means that when equipment fails anywhere in the grid, the replacement supply is not available on any timeline that protects public safety. The February 2026 executive order, by imposing new restrictions on Mexican energy-related imports, has, according to 2 people familiar with procurement planning inside Texas utilities, created exactly the conditions that grid engineers feared most: an administrative constraint on the supply chain arriving at the same moment that operational disruptions are reducing cross-border transmission capacity. This is the scenario that Sheinbaum's advisors, according to multiple people familiar with the internal deliberations in Mexico City, understood with complete clarity when they designed the CFE operational notice. The counter-move was not accidental, it was not improvised. It was the product of an administration led by someone with a PhD in energy engineering, supported by a CFE leadership team that has spent the past 18 months preparing for exactly this kind of bilateral confrontation. The USMCA review, the mandatory 6-year review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, is scheduled for 2026. Pending energy disputes from the Biden era, specifically a 2022 U.S. trade complaint, alleging that Mexico's energy policies unfairly disadvantaged American companies in favor of CFE and Pemex, were never resolved. They are now arriving at the review table at the same moment that this executive order has sharpened every bilateral tension to its finest edge. There are 4 scenarios that analysts and officials familiar with both governments are now modeling, and understanding the probability of each one is essential for anyone in Texas, anywhere in the Southwest, or anywhere in the country whose retirement savings, property values, or business operations depend on reliable and affordable electricity. The first scenario, which multiple people briefed on back-channel communications between the two governments assign a probability of roughly 35%, is a negotiated de-escalation within the next 30 days. In this scenario, the executive order is administratively modified to exclude the specific transformer and electrical component imports that are most critical to the Texas grid build-out, and CFE lifts its transmission reduction in exchange for formal assurances that the USMCA energy dispute consultations will be structured in a way that addresses Mexico's core sovereignty concerns. This scenario is plausible because both governments have significant economic incentives to avoid a prolonged standoff. Mexico's economy remains deeply tied to U.S. trade, and Texas's industrial base has no credible short-term alternative to the supply chains that run through Mexico. The second scenario, assigned a probability of approximately 30% by the same sources, is a protracted stalemate lasting through the summer of 2026. In this scenario, neither government blinks, the CFE transmission reduction remains in place, and Texas enters the summer peak demand season with reduced cross-border capacity and a transformer supply chain that is constrained by the import restrictions. The consequences in this scenario range from significant increases in wholesale electricity prices. ERCOT solar generation reduced wholesale prices from $332 per megawatt hour in summer 2023 to $80 per megawatt hour in summer 2024. But that trend depends on continued build-out of generation capacity that is now in jeopardy. 2. In a worst-case weather event, emergency conservation orders and rolling outages affecting residential and commercial customers across the state. The third scenario, probability approximately 25%, is an escalation in which the administration responds to Sheinbaum's countermove with additional executive action, potentially invoking emergency powers under the Federal Power Act or further trade restrictions, prompting Mexico to formalize its transmission reductions and potentially extend them to additional interconnection points. In this scenario, the USMCA review becomes a full-scale diplomatic crisis, and the energy supply chain disruptions extend well beyond Texas to affect the broader Southwest and the LNG export terminals along the Gulf Coast, which, as the Atlantic Council analysis noted, are themselves grid-connected and vulnerable to ERCOT instability. The fourth scenario, assigned the lowest probability, roughly 10%, but carrying the highest consequence, is a scenario in which a combination of summer heat, reduced cross-border capacity, transformer supply constraints, and a significant weather event produce a grid reliability emergency that forces ERCOT to implement rotating outages across the state for an extended period. Grid reliability engineers who spoke to this channel on condition of anonymity described this as a tail risk scenario, unlikely under any individual stress condition, but increasingly plausible as multiple stress conditions converge simultaneously. The people who would bear the greatest burden in that scenario are the elderly, the medically vulnerable, and the lower-income residents who cannot afford backup generation. They are, with painful irony, precisely the demographic that both governments claim to be protecting with their competing energy sovereignty narratives. This is the broader significance of what is happening right now, and it is the reason this story matters to every American, not just Texans. The energy relationship between the United States and Mexico is not a peripheral trade issue. It is infrastructure. It is the physical foundation on which tens of millions of Americans heat their homes, power their hospitals, run their businesses, and charge the devices that keep them connected to the world. The decision to treat that relationship as a lever in a broader geopolitical confrontation, without apparent awareness of or regard for the precise technical warnings that government-funded research institutions had placed in front of policymakers a full year in advance, is not a partisan observation. It is an engineering observation, and the people who will answer for it, or fail to answer for it, are the people making decisions in Washington and Mexico City right now. If you have watched this video to the end, you are the kind of informed citizen that this channel exists to serve. Subscribe now, not because this channel will tell you what to think about these decisions, but because this channel will continue to bring you the documented, sourced, chronological account of what is actually happening as it happens. The next video will track the 72-hour response from ERCOT and the Texas Public Utility Commission, and will include testimony from grid reliability engineers who have agreed to speak on the record about what the summer 2026 planning window actually looks like under current conditions. Like this video, share it with someone in Texas, and ask yourself this question in the comments. When the history of this confrontation is written, will the executive order that started it be remembered as an act of American energy strength, or as the decision that exposed how fragile American energy infrastructure actually is? That question does not have an easy answer, but the answer matters, and it is being written right now.